The Man Who Wouldn't Die, The Mysterious Death of Rasputin, the strangest murder in Russian history. Alright, settle in, because tonight we're talking about one of the most bizarre, unbelievable deaths in all of history. I'm talking about Grigori Rasputin, the Siberian mystic who somehow became one of the most powerful people in Russia, and then absolutely refused to die when people tried to kill him. Picture this: December 1916, St. Petersburg, Russia. A group of Russian nobles has finally had enough of this weird peasant monk who's basically running their country for his influence over the royal family. They've got a plan. They're going to poison him with enough cyanide to kill 5 men. Foolproof, right? Except Rasputin eats the poisoned cakes and drinks the poisoned wine, and nothing happens. He just asks for more. So they shoot him. He goes down, they think he's dead, but then he gets back up and tries to escape. So they shoot him 3 more times. Then they beat him up with a metal rod. Then they wrap him in a carpet, tie him up, and throw him into the freezing Neva River. And according to the autopsy, he was still alive when he hit the water. He drowned. This dude would not die, and that's just the ending of the story. The beginning and middle are somehow even weirder. So grab your drink, get comfortable, and let's dive into the absolutely insane life and death of Grigori Rasputin, the mad monk of Russia, the mystic who seduced an empire, and the man who took more killing than a horror movie villain. Part 1: The Peasant Prophet. Before Rasputin became the most famous mystic in Russian history, before he was whispering in the Tsar's ear and allegedly sleeping with half the aristocracy, he was just some weird kid from a tiny village in Siberia that nobody had ever heard of. Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin was born around 1869. Records are fuzzy because you know Siberian peasant village. In Pokrovskoye, a settlement so remote and insignificant that it barely appears on maps even today. We're talking middle of nowhere Russia, where winter lasts about 9 months, and the closest thing to entertainment is watching snow fall. His father was a farmer, his mother was a farmer, everybody in the village was basically a farmer. This was not a place where you expected future kingmakers to come from, but young Grigori was different, and not in a good way, according to his neighbors. As a kid, Rasputin apparently had a reputation for being strange. He'd wander off into the woods for days at a time. He claimed to have visions. People said he could see through walls, read minds, predict the future. Now, whether any of this was true or whether Rasputin was just really good at reading people and playing up the mysticism, we'll never know, but the reputation stuck. He also had a reputation for being, let's say, overly interested in the village girls. Even as a teenager, Rasputin was apparently quite the ladies' man, which is weird because by all accounts he wasn't particularly good looking. Tall and gangly, with long, greasy hair, a scraggly beard, and those intense, piercing eyes that people said could look right into your soul. But despite his oddness, or maybe because of it, women seemed drawn to him. This would become a major theme throughout his life, and one of the main reasons people eventually wanted him dead. The story goes that when Rasputin was about 18 years old, he had some kind of spiritual experience that changed everything. The details vary depending on who's telling the story, but the general idea is that he either A. had a vision of Virgin Mary while working in the fields, B. met a mysterious holy man who taught him spiritual secrets, C. went on a pilgrimage and had some kind of religious awakening, D. all of the above. Whatever actually happened, Rasputin came back from this experience claiming to have special powers. He said he could heal the sick, predict the future, and communicate directly with God. He started calling himself a strannik, a holy wanderer. and began traveling around Russia visiting monasteries and holy sites. Now, here's the thing: Russia in the late 1800s was absolutely obsessed with mysticism and religion. The Russian Orthodox Church was huge, but there was also this whole underground culture of folk healers, mystics, and self proclaimed holy men who wandered the countryside performing miracles and collecting donations. Some of these people were genuine believers who thought that they had divine powers. Some were con artists. Most were probably somewhere in between. Rasputin seemed to be a bit of both. He clearly believed in his own mystical abilities, but he also knew how to work a crowd and wasn't above using psychological tricks to enhance his reputation. The thing that really made Rasputin's reputation was his supposed ability to heal the sick. And here's where things get interesting, because there's actually some evidence that he could do something. Multiple accounts from people who knew him describe incidents where Rasputin could visit someone who was sick or injured, and after he prayed over them or touched them or just stared at them with those intense eyes, they'd start to feel better, sometimes dramatically better. Now, was this divine intervention, hypnosis, the placebo effect, some combination? We can't know for sure, but whatever it worked often enough that Rasputin developed a serious reputation as a healer. Word spread, people started seeking him out specifically, and eventually word of this mysterious Siberian mystic who could work miracles reached St. Petersburg, the capital of the Russian Empire. This is where everything changes. By around 1903, Rasputin had made his way to St. Petersburg. He was in his early 30s, still looked like a wild peasant with his long hair and beard and dirty peasant clothes, and he probably smelled like he'd been walking across Russia for months because, well, he had. But St. Petersburg in the early 1900s was a weird place. The aristocracy was bored, decadent, and desperate for meaning. They tried everything. They tried everything: literature, art, philosophy, revolution, sex, drugs, and nothing quite filled the void. So, of course, they turned to mysticism. Rich noble ladies would hold salons where they'd invite mystics, spiritualists, and holy men to come demonstrate their powers. It was like a spiritual fashion show. Everyone wanted the newest, most exotic holy man at their party. Rasputin was perfect for the scene. He was exotic, a real Siberian peasant, not some fake aristocrat playing at spirituality. He was charismatic in his own weird way, and he had this whole mysterious healer thing going on for him. He started getting invited to aristocratic homes. He'd pray with people, tell them about his visions, heal their various ailments, most of which were probably psychosomatic anyway. And most importantly, he'd stare at the noble ladies with those hypnotic eyes and tell them things about themselves that seemed impossibly accurate. The nobles ate it up. Rasputin went from nobody to the hottest spiritual guru in St. Petersburg in just a few years. But he wasn't content to be just a party trick for bored aristocrats. He wanted real power. And in 1905, he got his chance. Part 2: Enter the Romanovs. In 1905, through a series of connections and recommendations, Rasputin managed to get an introduction to the most powerful family in Russia, the Romanovs. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children, including their only son, Alexei. This meeting would change Russian history, no exaggeration. To understand how Rasputin ended up basically running Russia, you need to understand the Romanovs and their very specific problem. Tsar Nicholas II was not a great leader. He was a decent guy personally, loved his family, liked taking walks, enjoyed a good military parade. But as an absolute monarch, ruling over the largest empire on earth during a period of massive social upheaval, he was way out of his depth. His wife Alexandra was even more problematic. He was actually a German princess originally named Alix of Hesse, and she never really fit in with the Russian society. The aristocracy didn't like her because she was foreign and standoffish. She was deeply religious, deeply superstitious, and absolutely paranoid about threats to her family. They had four daughters first: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Beautiful girls, but in Imperial Russia, what they needed was a son, an heir, someone to continue the Romanov dynasty. Finally, in 1904, Alexandra gave birth to Alexei, the long-awaited male heir. There was celebration across Russia. The dynasty was secure. Everything was going to be fine. Except there was a problem, a big one. Alexei had hemophilia. If you don't know what hemophilia is, it's a genetic blood disorder where your blood doesn't clot properly. Even a minor bump or cut can cause internal bleeding that won't stop. In the early 1900s, before modern medicine, hemophilia was basically a slow death sentence. Most boys with the condition didn't live past their teens, and Alexei had a severe case. The hemophilia came from Alexandra's side of the family. Queen Victoria of England was a carrier, and she passed it down through her daughters to various European royal families. It was called the royal disease, and it had killed multiple princes and nobles across Europe. For the Romanovs, this was a catastrophe. Their only son, the heir to the Russian throne, could die at any moment from something as simple as a nosebleed or a bruised knee, and there was absolutely nothing the doctors could do about it. This is where Rasputin comes in. The first time Rasputin was brought to the palace to see Alexei, the boy was having one of his bleeding episodes. He'd injured his leg, the details vary, but probably he'd just bumped it against something, and internal bleeding had caused massive swelling. The leg had ballooned up, the boy was in excruciating pain, and the doctors were saying he might not survive. Alexandra was hysterical. Nicholas was helpless. The best doctors in Russia were standing around basically saying, "There's nothing we can do except wait and see if he stops bleeding on his own." Then Rasputin walked into the room. What happened next had been told and retold so many times that it's hard to separate fact from legend. But the basic story is this: Rasputin sat down next to Alexei's bed. He didn't do anything dramatic, no rituals, no elaborate prayers. He just looked at the boy with those intense eyes, spoke to him in a calm, quiet voice, and told him he would be okay. And Alexei's bleeding stopped. Within hours, the boy was feeling better. The swelling went down, the crisis passed, Alexei survived. Now, was this actually a miracle? Modern doctors have theories. Some suggest that Rasputin's calm presence helped reduce Alexei's anxiety, which in turn reduced his heart rate and blood pressure, which could have helped slow the bleeding. Others suggest that Rasputin convinced the doctors to stop giving Alexei aspirin, which they'd been using as a painkiller. And aspirin actually makes bleeding worse because it's a blood thinner. Or maybe Rasputin really did have some kind of a healing power. We'll never know for sure. But from Alexandra's perspective, this peasant mystic had just saved her son's life when the best doctors in Russia couldn't do anything. Rasputin had performed a miracle. From that moment on, Alexandra was completely devoted to Rasputin. He could do no wrong in her eyes. When Alexei had bleeding episodes, which happened frequently, Alexandra would send for Rasputin. Sometimes he'd come to the palace, sometimes he'd send a telegram with prayers and reassurances, but somehow Alexei always seemed to get better after Rasputin intervened. To Alexandra, Rasputin wasn't just a holy man, he was literally the only thing keeping her son alive. He was sent by God to protect the heir to the Russian throne. And Rasputin, well, he was smart enough to understand that he now had the most powerful woman in Russia completely in his pocket. Here's where Rasputin's story gets really interesting, because while he had the emperors convinced that he was a holy man sent by God, his actual lifestyle was not very holy. Rasputin lived in a small apartment in St. Petersburg, and this place became legendary. People described it as filthy, smelling like sweat and alcohol, with religious icons on the walls next to empty wine bottles. Rasputin would hold the late night gatherings where nobles, priests, and random seekers would crowd into this tiny space to hear him preach and witness his spiritual power. But these weren't your typical prayer meetings. Rasputin had this whole philosophy about sin and redemption that was, to put it mildly, unorthodox. He believed that you had to sin in order to truly repent, that divine grace came through experiencing the depths of human weakness. In practice, this meant Rasputin's spiritual sessions often involved heavy drinking, wild dancing, and a whole lot of inappropriate touching. He would grab women's hands, stroke their hair, stare into their eyes with that hypnotic gaze, and tell them they needed to surrender to sin in order to be saved. And somehow this worked. Noble ladies who should have been scandalized instead found themselves drawn to him. Some claimed he could read their deepest secrets just by looking at them. Others said being in his presence was like a religious experience. More than a few probably slept with him, though the exact details are disputed. The aristocratic men of St. Petersburg were not very happy about this. The dirty peasant was influencing the emperors, spending time alone with their wives and daughters, drinking their wine, smelling up their parties, generally making a mockery of their social order. But what could they do? Alexandra protected Rasputin absolutely. Any criticism of him was taken as a personal attack on her and her son. Nicholas, who was weak willed and completely dominated by his wife, refused to do anything about it. By around 1910 to 1912, Rasputin wasn't just the royal family's mystical advisor, he was actively influencing government policy. Alexandra would ask Rasputin's opinion on everything, from military appointments to political decisions. Rasputin, who had no education, no understanding of politics or military strategy, and was often drunk, would give his advice. Alexandra would often then pressure Nicholas to follow this advice. Government ministers started realizing that if they wanted to keep their jobs, they needed to stay on Rasputin's good side. Some tried to befriend him, others tried to bribe him, all of them resented him. Rasputin started taking payments from people who wanted favors. Need a government contract? Talk to Rasputin. Want a promotion in the military? Rasputin can arrange it. Trying to avoid corruption charges? Rasputin knows people. He was essentially running a pay-to-play scheme out of his filthy apartment whilst also claiming to be a holy man and a spiritual advisor to the Empress of Russia. The Russian people were watching all of this and going, "What the hell is happening to our country?" By 1912-1914, Rasputin's reputation had gone from controversial mystic to national scandal. Newspapers were publishing cartoons of him. People were writing songs mocking him. The Orthodox Church officially investigated him for heresy, though they couldn't quite pin anything on him because Alexandra kept protecting him. There were constant rumors about his sex life. People claimed he was sleeping with half the noble women in St. Petersburg, including some very specific and very scandalous accusations. Whether all these rumors were true or is debatable. Some definitely were, some were probably exaggerated, but the perception was that mattered. The most damaging rumor was that Rasputin was having an affair with Alexandra herself. This almost certainly wasn't true. Alexandra was deeply religious and devoted to Nicholas, and there was no real evidence anything physical happened between her and Rasputin. But people believed it because the relationship was so clearly inappropriate, even if it wasn't sexual. Here's how bad it got. Russian soldiers going off to fight in World War I, which started in 1914, were joking that they were fighting and dying while some dirty peasant monk was sleeping with their empress. That's not great for morale. The aristocracy, the church, the military, the common people, everyone hated Rasputin. Everyone except the one person who mattered, Alexandra. And through her, he had access to the Tsar. When World War I started in 1914, Russia was not ready. The military was outdated, the supply chains were a mess, and the leadership was incompetent. Russia started losing badly. Nicholas decided he needed to personally take command of the military. Bad idea, he had no military experience. This meant he was away from St. Petersburg for long periods, leaving Alexandra effectively in charge of the government. Alexandra, who relied heavily on Rasputin's advice. Rasputin, who was a drunk Siberian peasant with no understanding of governance. You can see where this is going. Alexandra, guided by Rasputin, started firing competent government ministers and replacing them with Rasputin's cronies, people who either owed him favors or were too incompetent to threaten his influence. The Russian government, already struggling with the war, became increasingly dysfunctional. Meanwhile, Russian soldiers were dying by the hundreds of thousands. The economy was collapsing, food was scarce, and everyone knew that somehow this was all connected to the fact that a crazy monk was running the country. Something had to be done. Someone had to stop Rasputin. Enter Prince Felix Yusupov and the murder plot. By the late 1916, a group of Russian nobles had decided that Rasputin had to die, not just be removed from power or exiled, he had to be killed. They tried getting rid of him through official channels, tried convincing the Tsar to banish him, tried everything they could think of. Nothing worked because Alexandra always protected him. So they decided to take matters into their own hands. The main conspirator was Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia. Felix was young, handsome, fabulously rich, and bisexual, which was scandalous, but he was too rich for anyone to do anything about it. He was also increasingly desperate about the state of Russia. Felix claimed that his motivation was purely patriotic. He wanted to save Russia from Rasputin's influence. But there was probably also a personal element. Some historians suggest that Felix had previously befriended Rasputin and might have been attracted to him, then felt betrayed or embarrassed by the relationship. Felix later denied this, but his descriptions of Rasputin in his memoirs are interesting. The other main conspirators were Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin of the Tsar, also young and handsome; Vladimir Purishkevich, a right-wing politician who hated Rasputin; Dr. Stanislaus Lazovert, who provided the poison; and possibly a few others, whose exact involvement is unclear. These men were not professional assassins, they were aristocrats playing at murder. This is important to remember because it explains why everything that followed was such a complete disaster. The plan was actually pretty straightforward, or so they thought. Step 1. Felix would invite Rasputin to his palace late at night, using the excuse that he wanted Rasputin to meet his wife, who was supposedly very interested in meeting the famous holy man. Step 2. Felix would serve Rasputin tea and cakes that had been laced with cyanide, enough cyanide to kill several men, just to be sure. Step 3. Rasputin would eat the poisoned food, die quickly, and they'd dump his body in the Neva River. Step 4. With Rasputin gone, Russia would be saved. Simple, right? What could possibly go wrong? On the night of December 29th or early morning of December 30th, depending on how you count it, Felix sent a message to Rasputin inviting him to come over to the Yusupov palace around midnight. Rasputin agreed. He was used to those late-night invitations from nobles. The conspirators prepared everything. They set up a basement room in the palace with a cozy atmosphere, rugs, furniture, a phonograph playing music to cover any suspicious sounds. Dr. Lazovert brought the cyanide and carefully mixed it into the cream filling of several small cakes and into glasses of wine. The other conspirators, Dmitry Purishkevich and the others, waited upstairs, ready to help dispose of the body once Rasputin was dead. Around 12:30 a.m., Rasputin arrived at the palace. Felix met him and led him down to the basement room. Rasputin was in a good mood, dressed in his best peasant shirt, which Felix noted was embroidered by the Empress herself, awkward, ready for a pleasant evening. Felix offered him the cakes and wine. Rasputin declined at first. He'd already eaten, he said. But Felix insisted it would be rude not to try the cakes. So Rasputin ate one of the poisoned cakes. And nothing happened. Rasputin chatted pleasantly, asking about Felix's wife, who wasn't actually there. He seemed totally fine, no signs of poisoning at all. Felix, starting to panic, offered him wine. Rasputin drank a glass of the poisoned wine. Still nothing. They talked for a while. Felix was getting increasingly nervous. Rasputin asked for another cake, then another glass of wine. He ate and drank repeatedly, consuming enough cyanide to kill a dozen men. 2 hours passed. Rasputin was completely fine, if maybe a little drunk from all the wine. He was in a great mood, actually, playing with Felix's guitar and singing Russian folk songs in his terrible voice. Felix was losing his mind. What was happening? Why wasn't the poison working? Was Rasputin actually supernatural? Was he protected by dark forces? The truth was probably more mundane. Either the cyanide had degraded, cyanide loses potency over time, or Dr. Lazovert had been too nervous and hadn't mixed it properly, or possibly the sugar in the cakes had somehow neutralized it. But in the moment, to Felix, it seemed like Rasputin really was unkillable. Around 2:30 a.m., Felix excused himself and went upstairs to consult with the other conspirators. The poison isn't working, he told them. What do we do? They decided they'd have to shoot him. Dmitri gave Felix his revolver. Felix went back downstairs where Rasputin was still happily sitting around, now asking when he'd get to meet Felix's wife. Felix said his wife would be down shortly, but in the meantime, would Rasputin like to see some interesting artwork he had? There was this beautiful crucifix he wanted to show him. Felix led Rasputin over to a cabinet with a crucifix on it. Rasputin stood there looking at it, his back to Felix. Felix pulled out the revolver and shot Rasputin in the chest at point-blank range. Rasputin screamed and collapsed to the floor. Finally, it was over. The conspirators came rushing downstairs. They found Rasputin lying on the floor in a pool of blood, not moving. Felix checked his pulse. Nothing. He was clearly dead. They stood around discussing what to do with the body. Felix was shaking, probably in shock from having just killed someone. Dr. Lazovert wanted to examine the body to confirm death. They debated how to best get the corpse to the river without being seen. Felix, still in shock, went over to Rasputin's body. He needed to confirm it was really over. He bent down close, looking at Rasputin's face. Rasputin's eyes snapped open. With a roar of rage, Rasputin grabbed Felix by the throat. Felix screamed. The dead man was not only alive, but incredibly strong, squeezing Felix's neck with both hands. The other conspirators rushed over and managed to pull Rasputin off Felix, but Rasputin, despite having been poisoned and shot in the chest, somehow found the strength to fight them off. He stumbled towards the door, then found the stairs and started climbing. Felix and the others chased after him, but Rasputin was moving with desperate strength. He burst out of the palace and into the courtyard, screaming for help. "Felix, you've killed me," he shouted. "I'll tell everything to the Empress." Purishkevich ran out after him with a revolver. He fired and missed, fired again and missed. Rasputin was still moving, still trying to escape. Purishkevich steadied his arm and fired a third time. This bullet hit Rasputin in the back. He stumbled but kept going. Purishkevich fired the fourth time, hitting Rasputin in the head. Finally, Rasputin collapsed in the snow. The conspirators surrounded him, breathing hard. This time they made sure. Felix grabbed a rubber club and beat Rasputin repeatedly in the head, just to be completely certain. Rasputin didn't get back up. By now it was around 4 a.m., and the conspirators were exhausted, terrified, and covered in blood. They wrapped Rasputin's body in a heavy cloth, tied it with ropes, and loaded it into a car. They drove to the Petrovsky Bridge over Neva River. The river was frozen, but there was a hole in the ice. They pushed Rasputin's body, still wrapped and tied, through the hole into the freezing water. Then they went home, destroyed their bloody clothes, and tried to figure out how to explain what they'd done. 2 days later, on January the 1st, 1917, someone walking along the frozen river noticed a dark shape under the ice. Police were called. They broke through the ice and pulled out a body wrapped in cloth and bound with ropes. It was Rasputin. The autopsy revealed the truly horrifying truth. Rasputin had been poisoned, shot 3 times, once in the chest, once in the back, once in the head, beaten severely, and then thrown into freezing water. But the cause of death? Drowning, which meant that after everything, the poison, the bullets, the beating, Rasputin still had been alive when he hit the water. The autopsy found water in his lungs, proof that he'd been breathing when he went into the river. His hands had worked free of the ropes. He'd tried to claw his way out of the cloth he was wrapped in. Grigori Rasputin, the mad monk of Russia, had literally survived everything his killers threw at him, only to finally die by drowning in the freezing Neva River. Part 4: The Aftermath and Legacy. The murder of Rasputin didn't save Russia. If anything, it made things worse. When Alexandra found out that Rasputin was dead, she was devastated. She'd lost the one person she believed could help her son alive, the one person she trusted to guide her. She demanded that the murderers be punished severely. But here's the problem: the murderers were aristocrats, including a Grand Duke who was the Tsar's cousin. Nicholas couldn't exactly execute his own relatives. So Felix was exiled to one of his country estates, not much of a punishment when you're one of the richest men in Russia. Dmitri was sent to the Persian front, which actually saved his life, as we'll see, and Purishkevich was basically given a warning. The Russian people, meanwhile, saw the murder as proof of how corrupt and dysfunctional the monarchy had become. The aristocracy was literally murdering each other in palace intrigues, while the country was falling apart. Less than 3 months after Rasputin's death, the February Revolution broke out. Riots, strikes, and mutinies swept across Russia. The army refused to fire on protesters. The government collapsed. On March 15, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty was over. The conspirators who'd killed Rasputin, thinking they were saving the monarchy, had just actually accelerated its collapse. Rasputin had been a symptom of the system's dysfunction, not the cause. Killing him didn't fix anything. In July 1918, the Bolsheviks, who'd taken power in the October Revolution, executed the entire Romanov family in a basement in Ekaterinburg. Nicholas, Alexandra, Alexei, and all 4 daughters were shot and bayoneted to death. Young Alexei, the boy whose hemophilia had brought Rasputin into the family's life in the first place, died at age 13. His body was dumped in a mine shaft with the rest of his family. Grand Duke Dmitri, one of Rasputin's murderers, survived because he'd been sent to Persia and managed to escape Russia during the revolution. He lived the rest of his life in exile in Western Europe. Felix Yusupov also escaped and lived in Paris, where he spent decades dining out on his story of killing Rasputin. He wrote memoirs, gave interviews, and generally portrayed himself as the patriot who tried to save Russia. He lived until 1967, dying at age 80. Rasputin's death became the stuff of legend almost immediately. The story of the man who wouldn't die, who survived poison and bullets and beating, has been told and retold countless times. Some details have probably been exaggerated. Felix's memoir, which is the main source for a lot of the story, was written years later, and he had every reason to dramatize events. Some historians question whether Rasputin really consumed as much poison as claimed, or whether all the details about him getting back up after being shot are accurate. But the basic facts are undeniable. Rasputin was poisoned, shot multiple times, beaten, and thrown into a freezing river, and he was still alive when he entered the water. That alone is incredible enough without any embellishment. Of course, being Rasputin, even his death spawned conspiracy theories. Some people claim he wasn't really dead, that he somehow survived and escaped Russia. There are occasional reports of Rasputin sightings in Siberia or other remote places in the years after 1916, though none have ever been confirmed. Others suggest that British Secret Service agents were actually involved in the murder, that they wanted Rasputin dead because he was supposedly pushing for Russia to make peace with Germany, which would have been bad for Britain. There is some circumstantial evidence for this. British agents were in St. Petersburg at the time, and they definitely hated Rasputin, but no smoking gun. The most persistent conspiracy theory is that Rasputin put a curse on the Romanov family before he died, prophesying that they would all be dead within a year and that Russia would suffer greatly. Some versions of the story claim that Rasputin left a letter predicting the revolution and the family's death. Whether Rasputin actually left such a letter is debatable. The supposed text of it only appeared years after the fact. But given that he was murdered by the Russian nobles in the middle of a disastrous war, while the country was on the brink of revolution, you didn't need mystical powers to predict that things weren't going to end well for the monarchy. Part 5: Understanding the Man. So, who was Grigori Rasputin really? Was he a holy man, a con artist, a sexual predator, a mystic, or some combination of all of these? There is evidence that Rasputin genuinely believed in his spiritual mission. He really did think he had a special connection to God. His religious beliefs, though unorthodox, seemed sincere. He spent years as a religious pilgrim before he even came to St. Petersburg, walking thousands of miles across Russia, visiting holy sites. Multiple people who knew him described moments of genuine spiritual depth, times when he seemed to be sincerely praying or helping people without any obvious personal gain. He apparently never charged money for his healing sessions, though he accepted gifts, which is a fine line. His ability to help Alexei was real, even if the mechanism might have been psychological rather than supernatural. Whatever he was doing, it worked, and it gave comfort to a desperate mother whose son was dying. But there is also massive evidence that Rasputin was cynically manipulating people for power and wealth. His sin to repent philosophy was awfully convenient for someone who liked drinking and sleeping around. His predictions and insights often used cold reading techniques, making vague statements and letting people read their own meaning into them. He absolutely leveraged his influence with Alexandra for personal gain, taking bribes and selling access to the royal family. He lived far beyond what a simple holy man should need, drinking expensive wine and wearing gifts from noble patrons. He was smart enough to carefully cultivate his image as a holy peasant, keeping his Siberian accent, wearing peasant clothes, playing up with the simple man of God routine, while simultaneously working the levers of power like a skilled politician. The sexual allegations against Rasputin are difficult to assess because the sources are biased. His enemies definitely exaggerated his sexual exploits for propaganda purposes. The rumors that he was sleeping with Alexandra were almost certainly false, spread to damage the monarchy. But it's also pretty clear that Rasputin did have numerous affairs with women, some of whom were vulnerable followers who came to him seeking spiritual guidance. Using religious authority to pressure people into sexual relationships is predatory, full stop. Whether he literally forced anyone or just used psychological manipulation and spiritual authority, the power dynamic was deeply problematic. Several women later wrote about their experiences with Rasputin, describing how he convinced them that having sex with him was part of their spiritual journey. That's textbook religious abuse, regardless of whether the women technically consented. And then there is the genuinely weird stuff that it's hard to explain away. Multiple credible witnesses, including people who had no reason to lie, described Rasputin accurately predicting future events, knowing things he shouldn't have known, and demonstrating what appeared to be genuine psychic abilities. His eyes were particularly noted by almost everyone who met him. These weren't just intense eyes. People described them as hypnotic, penetrating, impossible to look away from. Several people said that when Rasputin stared at them, they felt he could see into their souls. Was that just charisma and good cold reading? Maybe, but it's worth noting that even people who hated Rasputin and wanted him discredited would admit that there was something genuinely uncanny about him. And then there is the fact that he survived being poisoned, shot, and beaten. Yes, there are rational explanations for each of those things individually, but all of them together, it starts to seem like either Rasputin was the luckiest man in history or there was something genuinely unusual about him. The most likely answer is that Rasputin was all of these things at once. He was a genuine religious seeker who really believed in his spiritual mission, a skilled manipulator who knew how to work people's hopes and fears, a man with genuine healing abilities, whether supernatural or psychological, a cynical opportunist who used his position for personal gain, a charismatic figure with unusual abilities that people found uncanny, and a product of his time and place, shaped by the weird mystical culture of early 20th century Russia. People are complicated. Rasputin was more complicated than most. Part 6: The Medical Mystery. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. How did Rasputin actually survive all that? The cyanide failure is the easiest part to explain. Cyanide is actually pretty unstable. If Dr. Lazovert obtained it days or weeks before the murder, it might have degraded significantly. Cyanide also needs to be properly mixed and consumed on an empty stomach to be most effective. If the cyanide was baked into the cakes, the heat from baking could have degraded it further. Sugar can also interfere with cyanide's effectiveness, and if Rasputin had eaten before coming to the palace, which he said he had, the food in his stomach would have slowed absorption. Additionally, there is some suggestion that Rasputin might have built up a partial tolerance to certain poisons. He was paranoid about assassination attempts and reportedly took small doses of various substances to build immunity. Whether this is true or another legend is unclear, but it's not impossible. Or, and this is the theory some historians support, maybe the conspirators chickened out at the last minute and didn't actually put enough cyanide in the food. They were aristocrats playing at murder, not professional assassins. It's possible Dr. Lazavert got scared and used less poison than he claimed. This is harder to explain, but not impossible. The first shot from Felix hit Rasputin in the chest, but depending on the exact location, it might have missed vital organs. The human chest has a lot of empty space. If the bullets passed between the ribs and missed the heart and major blood vessels, it's entirely possible to survive such a wound, at least temporarily. Rasputin was also probably running on pure adrenaline at this point. The human body is capable of incredible feats when it's in survival mode. There are documented cases of people surviving multiple gunshot wounds and functioning for minutes or even hours afterward. The shots from Purishkevich were more serious. One hit him in the back, likely damaging organs, and one hit him in the head. But even the headshot wounds aren't always immediately fatal if the bullet doesn't hit the brainstem or destroy enough brain tissue. Medical science has documented cases of people surviving multiple gunshot wounds, even to the head, and remaining conscious and mobile for a surprisingly long time before finally succumbing. The most chilling part, that Rasputin was still alive when thrown into the river, is confirmed by the autopsy findings. Water in the lungs means he was breathing when he went into the water. But here's the thing, alive doesn't necessarily mean fully conscious or capable of escaping. Rasputin had been shot 3 times and beaten. He'd lost a lot of blood. He was probably in shock, possibly unconscious or barely conscious. When the body hits freezing water in that condition, it might trigger one last gasp reflex, the body's automatic response to cold water hitting in the face. This could draw water into the lungs even if the person is barely alive and not really capable of trying to escape. So, while it's technically true that Rasputin drowned, he was probably already dying from his wounds and barely clinging to life. The water just finished what the bullets and beating had started. Here's a dark thought. If Rasputin had received immediate medical attention after being shot, could he have survived? Possibly, with modern trauma surgery, definitely. Even in the 1916 medical technology, if he'd been rushed to a hospital immediately after the first shooting, before the additional shots and beating, he might have pulled through. The wounds were serious but potentially survivable. People have survived worse. Rasputin was a strong man, and he clearly had an incredible will to live. But of course, that was never going to happen. The conspirators weren't trying to save him, they were trying to make absolutely sure he was dead. Each additional injury made survival less likely, until finally drowning in the freezing Neva River finished the job. Part 7, Rasputin in Popular Culture. Rasputin's story is so wild that it had been retold countless times in books, movies, plays, and songs. He's become a cultural icon representing everything from mystical evil to misunderstood holiness, depending on who's telling the story. Let's address the elephant in the room. Yes, there is a 1978 disco song about Rasputin by the German group Boney M. And yes, it's absolutely ridiculous and also kind of a bop. Rara Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen, is probably not historically accurate. Again, no evidence, and and Alexandra had an affair. Again, no evidence he and Alexandra had an affair. But the song captures the popular image of Rasputin as the sexy, dangerous, unkillable figure. The lyrics even reference his death. They put some poison into his wine, he drank it all and said, "I feel fine." They shot him till he was dead. It's historically inaccurate in the details, but gets the general vibe right. This was a man who really did refuse to die. That song introduced Rasputin to a whole new generation and remains one of the main ways people today know about him, which is hilarious but also kind of fitting. Rasputin probably would have loved being immortalized in a disco song. Rasputin had been portrayed in dozens of films, usually as either the demonic villain, dark, hypnotic, evil incarnate who seduced the empress and destroyed Russia through his dark magic, These versions play up the mystical and sinister elements. The tragic mystic, a genuine holy man who was misunderstood and destroyed by jealous aristocrats. These versions emphasize his healing abilities and religious sincerity. The weird dude, somewhere in between, acknowledging both his genuine abilities and his obvious flaws. These tend to be the most historically accurate. Some notable portrayals include Christopher Lee in Rasputin, the Mad Monk, 1966, campy and fun. Alan Rickman in 1996 HBO film, one of the better dramatic portrayals. Gérard Depardieu in a 2011 Russian-French film, controversial but interesting, and various animated versions in children's films, usually making him more comedic. Over time, Rasputin has become shorthand for a certain type of figure, the shadowy advisor who manipulates the powerful from behind the scenes, who seems to have supernatural influence over leaders, who refuses to go away no matter how many times you try to get rid of them. Political commentators will describe advisors as the Rasputin of the White House or Putin's Rasputin. That one came up a lot with various Russian political figures. It's become a cultural reference point for corrupt, mysterious influence on power. Because of all the genuine mysteries surrounding Rasputin, his healing abilities, his influence over Alexandra, the various assassination attempts before the final successful one, the weirdness of his death, he's become a favorite subject for conspiracy theorists. Theories include he was actually a German spy trying to make Russia lose World War I. He was a British agent. This one contradicts the previous one, but whatever. He had actual supernatural powers granted by dark rituals. He faked his death and escaped to Siberia. He placed a curse on the Romanovs that caused all their descendants to suffer. His preserved penis is in a museum in St. Petersburg. This one might be actually true, which is weird. Most of these are nonsense, but they show how Rasputin's real story was so bizarre that people feel compelled to add even more bizarre explanations. Part 8. What really happened? The final analysis. After looking at all the evidence, the testimonies, the autopsy reports, and the historical context, what can we actually say about Rasputin and his death? Rasputin was probably a genuine religious seeker with some real healing abilities, likely psychological, hypnotic, rather than supernatural. Also a cynical opportunist who used his position for personal gain. Charismatic and manipulative, skilled at reading people and telling them what they wanted to hear. Genuinely devoted to helping Alexei while also enjoying the power that gave him. Sexually inappropriate with many women, using his spiritual authority to manipulate them. Not actually having an affair with Alexandra, despite rumors. Increasingly drunk and erratic in his final years as the pressure mounted. Paranoid about assassination, with good reason as it turned out. He wasn't a saint, he wasn't a demon, he was a complicated, flawed human being who found himself in an impossible situation, massive power with no real position or protection, influence without official authority, trusted by one person, Alexandra, and hated by almost everyone else. The murder. The conspiracy to kill him was motivated partly by patriotism, partly by personal grievances, partly by class resentment. Poorly planned and executed by amateurs, far messier than it needed to be because the conspirators panicked. Probably involved poison that had degraded or was improperly administered. Definitely involved multiple gunshots, probably while Rasputin was in shock and running on adrenaline. Ended with drowning, though Rasputin was already dying from his wounds. The story of Rasputin surviving poison and bullets and beatings is true, but it's explainable through medical science. He didn't have supernatural protection, he just had a strong constitution, a lot of adrenaline, and medical treatment from people who were panicking and not doing things efficiently. Rasputin's death didn't save Russia, it just removed a symptom of a dying system. The real problems, the incompetent monarchy, the disastrous war, the economic collapse, the growing revolutionary sentiment, were all still there. If anything, the murder made things worse by further destabilizing Alexandra, who lost her main emotional support, demonstrating that the aristocracy was willing to commit murder rather than address real problems, showing the Russian people that their leaders were focused on palace intrigue while the country burned, removing one of the few people who might have convinced Alexander to make peace, though whether he would have is debatable. 3 months later, the whole system collapsed anyway. Rasputin's death was just one more crack in a dam that was already breaking. So here we are, over a century later, still talking about Grigori Rasputin, still trying to figure out who he really was, what he really could do, and how he really died. Was he a holy man or a charlatan, a healer or a hypnotist, a patriot or a traitor, a prophet or a con artist? The answer is probably yes to all of those things in different ways and at different times. Humans contain multitude, and Rasputin contained more multitudes than most. Even now, with all our historical research and medical knowledge, there are things about Rasputin we'll never truly understand. How did he help Alexei? Hypnosis, placebo effect, actual healing power? We can't know for sure. Did he really predict his own death and the fall of the Romanovs? The supposed letter might be fake, but he definitely knew people wanted him dead. What was really going on in his relationship with Alexandra? Was it purely spiritual or was there emotional manipulation? Both, probably. Could he really have survived if the conspirators have been less thorough? Modern doctors say maybe, but we'll never know. Perhaps the saddest part of the Rasputin story is that buried under all the legend and controversy was a real human being with real emotions and real suffering. He watched his son die in early childhood. He spent years as a wandering pilgrim, seeking spiritual truth. He found himself thrust into power and luxury he never imagined, and it probably corrupted him in ways he didn't fully recognize. He made enemies of almost everyone who mattered. He lived in constant fear of assassination, and in the end he died slowly and painfully, drowning in freezing water after being shot and beaten. That's a tragedy, regardless of what kind of person he was or what he did with this power. The biggest mystery isn't how Rasputin died or whether he had supernatural powers. The biggest mystery is how this one person, this uneducated Siberian peasant with no official position, no army, no money of his own, managed to wield so much influence over the most powerful empire on earth. Part of it was timing. He was in the right place at the right time with the right skills. Part of it was Alexandra's desperation to save her son. Part of it was the decadence and dysfunction of the Russian aristocracy. And part of it was probably genuine charisma and abilities that we don't fully understand. But mostly it was proof that individuals really can change history, for better or worse. One person in the right circumstances can influence events that affect millions. Rasputin's influence helped destabilize the Russian monarchy, which contributed to the revolution, which led to the Soviet Union, which shaped the entire 20th century. All because a peasant mystic could somehow help a little boy with hemophilia, and his mother would do anything to keep that mystic close. Grigori Rasputin, the mad monk, the holy devil, the man who wouldn't die, remains one of history's most fascinating enigmas. And now, every time you hear that Boney M song, you'll know the real story behind it. You're welcome. Sweet dreams, everyone, and if you wake up in the middle of the night with someone staring at you with intense hypnotic eyes, don't worry, it's probably just your imagination. Probably.